Hello and welcome to this tutorial for the ZSH Line Editor, or as I will be calling it from now on, the ZLE, to save my own tongue. So what exactly is the ZLE? In a sentence, it is the main tool for creating plugins and interactive command line features for the Z shell, such as the extremely popular Z shell auto suggestions, which, for example, if I type EC, it'll auto-complete it and suggest a previously typed command, and if I press right, it'll actually complete it and I can submit it. Now, exactly how does that work? Well, the plugin defines a couple widgets, and those widgets first append to the right buffer the suggestion. The widget uses ZLE highlight or region highlight to change the color of the suggestion to gray. And finally, it manipulates the cursor variable, as in the documentation here, to put the cursor back here and not to the end of the suggestion. And in fact, ZLE defines what happens when you press right, the right key, and what happens when you press enter. When you press enter, ZLE calls a widget called accept line. So before we get to actually writing our own ZLE widgets, let's look through some documentation and some basic features so you can actually find the things that you need to, write your own things. So first things first, you're going to create a function. Let's call it test1. And you're going to, let's say it echoes hello. Now, I'm going to declare it as a ZLE widget by typing ZLE new widget, name of the widget, useless widget, and it calls the function test1. Now you're going to try to call the widget like this, but it says widgets can only be called when ZLE is active. Now, widgets can only be called from within other widgets or with Bindkey. So let's bind this widget to the button home, but I don't know what key home is, so press Ctrl V and then home. That's the key code for home. Caret right bracket H. So we're going to bind key caret right bracket H to useless widget. Now whenever I press home, it echoes the thing. Very useful, right? Now let me just clear this. You can see a list of all available widgets with ZLE list all. There's quite a lot of them, so frankly you're going to have to read the documentation, which by the way is available at man ZSH ZLE. It's also available online in this URL, which I will put in the video description. It's a bit easier to read here. So the main things are Bindkey. You generally don't need the flags, but if you do, they're E, V, and A for whichever key map you're using, Emacs, V insert, or VCMD. Next, ZLE. The main things are all of these. F is a bit complex, but it's extremely useful. It's able to make sort of asynchronous updating things for your screen. Really cool. I'm not going to get into it because it's a little complicated, but it's in the documentation. ZLE N creates a widget with the name widget and binds to function. The widget is optional, so technically you can just write ZLE new test1 and it will bind to the function test1, but it overloads the definition, so it's a bit awkward and I don't recommend it. Next, ZLE U. This will append this text to the current right buffer, which is literally to the right of my current cursor. So if I create a function, test2, and I say ZLE U, oh my god, there's extra stuff. And then make that into a widget. Now when I press write something like this, write something, and P, it appends the text, right? Now the problem is I can't write the letter P, so you might not want to do that. Let me execute Z shell to clear that. The way you get around this is by defining function test2, and first you run the ZLE built-in widget, ZLE self-insert, which will insert the character that called this widget. Then ZLE U, oh my god, there's stuff and also a P. And when I press P, there's a P at the start. So if you bind something to a key that's alphanumeric, you want to actually self-insert it to make sure that it doesn't get erased from your keyboard. So just like you can see all of the widgets by ZLE, you can also see all of the bindings with just Bindkey. Now, it's a very, very long list, so you might have to look into this a little bit. But for example, let's say you want to bind something to the Enter key. So let's see, Control-V, Enter. The key code for it is ~M, so let's go Bindkey fgrep ~M. It says that accept line is bound to the Enter key. No big surprise there, but if we want to implement a widget that uses the key, we want to also call that widget so it doesn't get overridden. Let me, as an example, re-implement the entire history feature of ZSH function test3. All right. We're gonna echo the current buffer as described in here, the entire contents of the edit buffer, into something like, let's say, history.txt, and then ZLE accept line. Then let's define a widget out of it. Now, when I press enter, it should save them into the file. Let's test it. Let's say echo hello ls la. Let's see, ls la awk print field 2. Let's cat the file. And as you can see, it contains all the commands that we did. So essentially, it's a new history feature. Huh? Now, something you might be interested in are the ZLE M and U and R flags. ZLE U, of course, appends to the end of the buffer. ZLE M writes a string under the command prompt without disrupting the command prompt, which is really cool. And R puts multiple strings. It won't, for some reason, put the first one, so I'm going to give you an example. Let's define a function test5, and let's make it display some date time, all right? I'm going to write down this sort of annoying command, which is ZLE M. Then we're going to close that and close that again. Then I'm going to make that into a widget. So now that I'm typing, let's see how this works. So I'm like, oh, this is such a lovely day. Oh, am I late? Home. Huh? This is quite good. Let's see how the R flag works. If I change this to R, well, you have to put the first flag to be empty. I don't know why. I haven't really worked with it enough. But this is the string 1, string 2, string 3, and string 4. Now, if we look at what it prints, it sort of prints them in a similar list as ls would. Now, note that they are always sorted alphanumerically, so numbers first, then A to Z. So, you know, you might have to keep that in mind. If you want to clear the line below the command, you just write ZLE M empty string, and that'll sort it out. Now, in the documentation under user-defined widgets, you find many different built-in variables that are extremely useful to have access to. For example, the buffer is the entire line that you have. The cut buffer is the last item cut using one of the kill commands, which are the built-in widgets. The history numbers, the keys that you press to invoke the widgets, these are all incredibly useful. You can make such a rich sort of terminal experience for yourself if you really spend the time for it. You also have access to a couple of really cool ones like cursor. It is the position of the cursor. And let me just show you. You can do a very basic example. Function test8, so I don't spoil it. If cursor equals buffer, which is the length of the entire line, then echo you are at the end. Else echo you are somewhere else. Done. And let me just make that into a widget. You've seen it before. All right, let's see what happens. First of all, empty string, you are at the end, obviously. Let me type something and press home. You are at the end. Fair enough. Type something and then move away from the end. You are somewhere else. Huh? So you can do programming logic with this kind of thing, which is very useful. You can do different things based on where your cursor is, which is exactly what most of your keyboard shortcuts do. Now, most of the power of ZLE is not with writing stuff like this. It's writing widgets that actually call some of the default widgets, which are defined in the documentation. Well, first of all, there's special widgets, but also movement widgets and, you know, history control, stuff that is able to manipulate and append and go through the history and stuff like that. Now, when it comes to highlighting, the ZLE highlight and region highlight have slightly esoteric syntax, so honestly, don't ask me. You're going to have to Google around for it and probably read a mailing list or two, but they are defined in the documentation. It is what ZSH syntax highlighting, the plugin, does. It is why you have stuff like, if I say echo hello, that the first word is green and the second word is yellow, and the pipe is that color and the awk is that color, you know? That is all ZLE. I recommend specifically looking at the F flag for ZLE F, which installs the file descriptor handle, which can do a bunch of cool stuff. It's a bit more complex, but it's very useful. Finally, let me show you a little fun thing I wrote as a test. Let me source that, which is speed test. Speed test. Yep. Now, it will simply test my typing speed in the terminal in semi-real time, updating every time I press the space bar. You can also make it completely real time by introducing a loop that updates by itself every X milliseconds or whatever. So there's that. That's pretty much all I have to say on the topic, and this video is getting a bit long, so I bid thee adieu. Bye.